Good afternoon, distinguished delegates. We want to start our side event. I am William Kojo Ajimayabonsu. I'm the manager for mitigation and transparency support, providing support to developing countries in particular, but to all parties. This afternoon, we'll be sharing with you in terms of experiences in how countries can undertake assessments of the impacts of implementation of mitigation actions, which is commonly referred to as response measures, or mostly known as response measures under our convention discussions thereof. Certainly, we believe that with increased actions of mitigation, the impacts of these actions taken by countries is going to be prevalent, and therefore it becomes very necessary for us to look at how countries are able to assess these impacts, report on them, but also be able to address these impacts at the national level. We're pleased to have with us, I'll say, distinguished experts on this issue, working with us to see how we can move this agenda forward, but also having a country presentation from our colleague from South Africa, Brian, who will be doing a presentation indicating what is the experience in South Africa in undertaking that type of assessment. Then we would have Mr. Hector Pollitt, also with Cambridge Econometrics, seasoned modeling expert. He will also be sharing some experiences with that. And Mr. Aaron Cosby from ISD would also share with us the work that the ISD is also doing on that. The last but not the least, we have Mr. Pradeep Danlish from India, also sharing with us what Megazink, for which he is the CEO, is doing. And certainly we'll be working together with them on these issues, and we would be happy to learn how far they've come with this. And I hope we'll be able to take home some important messages as regards how these assessments can be done, because we've been talking about response measures for all these years, 22 years since the convention itself. And countries have been struggling to even understand what are the impacts and how can I even identify, even quantify them. So we'll try to see if there are any methods at all that will help us to look at those assessments. And I think it will be very important to know that we might be focusing also not only on cross-border impacts, that a party undertaking mitigation actions and having impacts on another party, but experiences also within country in terms of your own mitigation actions, the impacts also on the economy, the society, and communities, even within the same country. How do you even assess that? So pleased to have Brian with us, and unfortunately, Brian will need to rush into another meeting, so we'll give him the floor to do his presentation, and after the presentation, maybe take one or two quick questions because he's running away, and then we'll continue with the other presentations. So I'll give the floor now to Brian. Brian.
Thanks, William, and good afternoon, colleagues. I'm going to have a short presentation. There are three disclaimers. First, the first one is that I'm not an expert, so it's fair that I speak first and the experts on my left can speak later. I'm merely a government employee who does this work. The second one is, in South Africa, we have tried, in our way of managing climate change work, we've tried to shift away from the terminology that comes directly from this process, UNFCCC. We've chosen our own words. The word response measures, we do not use in the context of this work. I just want to be clear that for us, this is now the third point. For us, we undertake this work to inform our own domestic processes. I'm going to pick this up in my presentation. And secondly, to us, this is a contribution to Chapter 3 of the BUR. So that to me is important to start with. The part that the notion of response measures is a UNFCCC terminology. For us, we choose our own terms, and the big deal for us is understanding the effects of our own actions. And then we report that periodically to the UNFCCC through the channels that in this room we are familiar with. My name is Brian. I come from the Department of Environmental Affairs and work in the climate change branch. Next slide. It's a short presentation. Okay, so in about 5-6 years ago, we started developing. We have a national climate change response policy. One of the outputs that's expected from the climate change response policy is a climate change monitoring and evaluation system. The objective of the slide in front of you is merely to capture what to us are the components of that system. So we've been putting this together with many partners from the south and from the north. Primarily, it is to make our lives easier as we try to understand climate action in South Africa, what's going on, what is the impact of what's going on, both on mitigation and adaptation side, and also on tracking climate finance. I'm not going to talk to the slides itself, but what's important is the green parts at the bottom of the screen. Is that we've got underlying principles that guide the system itself. Again, the system is designed for South Africa to meet our own objectives of understanding the impacts of our ongoing actions. But today I'm going to talk mostly about the part that's written monitoring and evaluation guidelines. So if you go to the next slide. So that's the focus of today's presentation. Next slide. So the role of these guidelines, they are primarily to give guidance, to guide us on the assessment methods and approaches for assessing ongoing work that we call mitigation activities, to guide us on accounting for overlaps between mitigation policies and measures. You've got Department of this and Department of this doing actions independently. Our intention is to understand their impact and try to see how we can tell a narrative that says this is the impact of this particular measure versus that other one. To understand sustainable development benefits of those policies and measures, to have a sense to improve our own QA/QC procedures precisely of the information that we get. Next slide. So we've been rather ambitious, South Africa being South Africa. We've gone for a full set of guidelines that cover the IPCC sectors. So number 2 to number 6 covers energy waste sector, waste transport, IPPU, and AFOLU. And then we've got one that is overarching and describing the whole package. One of the key points here is this information on the, for you is the left, for me is the right, of who is helping us in this work. We are partnering with different organizations, governments to do this work. We are learning. We are far from knowing what we need to do. We know what we need to do. The how part is what we are fiddling with. So we're listening to different experts. I would have liked to listen to these presentations here. We're listening to different experts on how to do these pieces of work. But the key message of this slide is not only the scope of work we are doing, but is that we are working with different partners to do this work. Next slide. So a general outline of each of guidelines 2 to 6, which covers the sectors, is what you have on the screen. Step 1 is selecting the mitigation measures. Step 2 is selecting the indicators. Step 3 is undertaking the assessment itself. Then you've got quality control, and you've got a report. Doesn't that sound easy? It's not. But at least we've got a framework. As I said, I'll show towards the end where we've started. But basically, that's how we are approaching each of those sectors that we're working with. Next slide. For guidance, we are working with WRI. So we're using the tools from WRI. Domestically, in South Africa, as I said earlier, we have developed what we call a climate change M&E framework. This framework is a document, as shown in the book in the middle, that describes the whole package of how we intend undertaking the M&E. We don't use the word MRV. We use the word M&E because the scope of work, we've always felt that the notion of MRV is a mitigation-centric aspect, and the scope of our work is mitigation, adaptation, and support. So that book in the middle is giving a framework of how we intend to track these 3 aspects. And then on the right is South Africa-specific aspects using. We take the existing policies and then we try to understand their impact, but then for that we have to go to separate departments to get what exists there in those different government departments. Next slide. Summary of the guidelines, how to estimate M&E system indicators of climate relevant policies and strategies. So the question is how to do this. And as I said, we've got the framework. The devil is in the detail. I didn't want to use that. I was trying to run away from that phrase, but that's exactly what it is. We've got implementation indicators, impact indicators, and effectiveness indicators. I'm not going to talk in detail about this, but I just want to give you a sense of generically how we are undertaking this work. Next slide. The intention of this slide is okay. The intention is more to show the colorful part on the left and less of the blue part. In how we take the work forward, the overall steps is defining the policy or the strategy that is being assessed, describe the indicators that that we'll be looking at, identify the effects, quantify the effects, define the assessment boundary, estimate the effects, and then run a verification process, and then report. Yes, next slide. I think this is the last slide, William. We first started by looking at 2 strategies, the National Public Transport Strategy and the National Waste Management Strategies. I chose not to provide the results of this work. I'm celebrating the process. But we reported this in our first BUR, and in our second BUR, which is coming soon, we have increased the number of strategies that we are reporting on. And I didn't want to include the results for this presentation. The take-home message is that we have started the process. Like many other developing countries that have reported their BURs, we are reporting this information in Chapter 3 of the BUR, and we are learning as well going forward. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Because Brian needs to leave quickly, I will refrain from summarizing and maybe give the floor to colleagues for just one or two quick questions. Then he will need to leave. Any clarification question that you have? Oh, that's strange. Okay. Identify yourself and then ask your question. Yeah, please. No. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Marjan Peters from Maastricht University in the Netherlands. I wonder, could you elaborate a little bit on this verification issue? So there will also be verification. Will that be done by independent verifiers? How is that institutionally organized? Thank you very much.
Okay, a quick one. That's the last chance. Any other? Okay, otherwise, Brian, can you respond to that and you can take leave over?
On verification, we rely on information that is related to what we found out is that the department concerned does not only provide the information to us, so we rely on kind of a third-party information on the same policy itself. To simplify the response, we have not gone the route of independent third-party verification. It is something that we are considering and we are talking with relevant stakeholders about it, but we have not taken a decision on that process yet. So it's more of QC as opposed to QA part. So we have not gone the route of saying we're creating a body that's going to run an independent body that's going to run the verification process. And the real reason for that is that we are at a very early stage of doing this work. We prefer not to make it scary, cumbersome, and even not expensive for ourselves and also for those that we need this information from. So there are aspects that we are careful about: the notion of cost effectiveness, the notion of broad participation, and broad ownership.
Just before I allow you to leave, Brian, I mean, how has this also fitted into your existing, MRV arrangements within government? Because I know a number of ministries in governments have this monitoring evaluation departments. So how is this linked to the existing institutional arrangements?
Don't use past tense, William. It is an ongoing exercise. It's how are we on an ongoing basis fitting in the aspect of quantification of climate change impacts of the ongoing programs. And we use different approaches with different ministries because of the level of receptivity from one department to the other. So there is no one way of doing it, but the overall approach is to ensure that the relevant ministries are aware of the scope of information that we require on an annual basis to do this work. So we want to provide clarity on the scope of information that we need, clarity on the reasons why we require this information, and open an avenue for them to work with us even in the analysis itself of this work. We actually have just are beginning to implement a project that is funded through the CBIT, which intends to do precisely this notion of bringing in information sources, those stakeholders that are information sources, into a room on a period of 3 years for them to understand the scope of information that we will require for them, because it looks like we are in this trajectory, in this journey of seeking this information over time, so that they understand the scope of the information, why we want this information, how frequently we want it, in what form do we need it. And this is the program that we are now starting in 2017 to 2020 through the CBIT.
So thank you very much, Brian. And we're sorry you had to leave us quickly because there are a lot that we could discuss with you. But at any rate, thanks for the time with us, and see you. We'll move on with the presentations, and I would give the floor now to Hector. Cambridge Econometrics. Yeah, you can control the slide yourself. Okay, so Hector, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. You just say that? Yep. Great. Thank you all for coming. It's fantastic to see people here. My background is I'm an economist. My organization, Cambridge Econometrics, is known for very large and complicated models. I've got 15 minutes, but I'm not going to try and explain the models, and I'm going to talk about quantitative methods and a bit more generally. And for those of you that aren't familiar with modeling or haven't engaged in the past, maybe try to take some of the fear and mystique away from modeling in general. That's my aim anyway. I'm going to talk about three things. Introduction to modeling approaches. So the quotation marks there, just to show you what I mean by modeling, is perhaps a bit different to the more general view that's taken. It doesn't have to be big tools that are being used. Second bit of the presentation, more practical. If you want to engage in modeling, how to go about it, if you don't have existing capacity. And then I'll wrap up with two examples that are at different ends of the spectrum. One that is quite a basic low resource type approach, and then the full large scale modeling. And that's one in two different countries. Okay, so first principles, why do people do modeling? It's a very complicated issue, and there has to be a good reason for doing it. We're talking about assessing policies here, or response measures in the official parlance. If we were chemists or physicists, we'd go into our laboratory, do an experiment, prove one way or the other, this is good, this is bad. But when we're talking at macro level with policies, we can't do that. So we have to resort to the next best thing, which is basically a bit of reality that's been taken, stretched, and placed inside a computer. Models provide a simplification of reality. How they do that is up to the person that designs the model. Now, that simplification could be very, very simple, or it could take into account more of the details and nuances that exist in reality. Models provide quantitative impact, so numbers, basically. That helps with trade-offs. If you're talking about things that are in different units, for example, reducing emissions against number of jobs, then the models can help you with that. Levels of risk as well is getting into the more complicated approaches now, but increasingly what we're asked about is questions of resilience. So not just is this good or is this bad, but under different conditions of the world, where does this leave us exposed to things that are outside our control? Sometimes they identify unintended consequences. Yes. Even for me personally, I've been doing this for 15 years, and every now and then a model result that comes out that just goes, okay, I didn't think about that. So it's quite a powerful tool there. And then as I said at the bottom of the slide, models are also continuously in development, and as new technology and data become available, then we can take that on board. Now, in the past, I've grouped the available modeling approaches into these categories. They range from the most basic at the top right down to the most complicated. Now, simple analysis is what I call what's often described in English as back of the envelope calculations. So very limited data requirements, much more ad hoc in nature. You make use of the information that you have, you do the calculations, and you get some basic idea of what comes out. In the past, I've grouped the available modeling approaches into these categories. They range from the most basic at the top right down to the most complicated. Now, simple analysis is what I call what's often described in English as back of the envelope calculations. So very limited data requirements, much more ad hoc in nature. You make use of the information that you have, you do the calculations, and you get some basic idea of what comes out. In some ways, the next step above that is econometrics, or econometrics is difficult for people who are not economists or don't have that in the background, but the data requirements for that are also relatively limited, so it provides options when there's not so much data available. Systems of equations can be anything, again, from very simple, just putting 2 or 3 very basic calculations together, to something that approaches a large-scale modeling tool. And then as we go down the list, this is getting towards cases where you need a lot of data, you need a lot of time to develop these tools and a lot of resources. And I just bring this up. What we often talk about in this is the breadth and depth. So the depth is how much detail do you want to look at a particular issue on. And you can get tools that look at, say, one particular sector, like the transport sector, for example, in a lot of detail. The breadth is, do you want to look outside that sector to the rest of the economy or to the rest of the world and all the other processes going on? Now, in some cases, it's okay to just look at one of these things, but sometimes people need to look at both. Well, that's okay, but then we have the trade-off on the other side, which is you need a more complicated tool, you need more data, you need more time to do it, and bluntly, if you're the person that has to pay for it, you probably need more money to do it as well. So we have this range of options available. Now, I should say introductions at the top. Knowing that I work for Cambridge Econometrics, a very modeling focused organization, we often get approached by individuals often from countries with limited capacity at the moment. So, okay, look, Hector, we know we need to do some modeling. We need to get some numbers out to assess our policies with. We don't have any existing modeling tools at the moment. What should we do about it? Now, the first thing I usually say is, well, it depends, and say people aren't too happy with that response. So we have to talk through the options, and the 3 options are these at the bottom of the slide, really. You could develop your own tool. Now, that is quite a high resource, cost-intensive exercise. It requires a lot of data, it requires a lot of time, and there are advantages. So if you have the tool available in-house, you have your own staff learning from it, you can maintain it yourself, you can make sure that it can do the policies you want to look at, and you can basically keep it in a way you want it. The second option is a lower cost option. Take one of the existing tools that are out there, maybe tailor it a bit for your own purposes, operate under some kind of licensing arrangement. Yes, you will save money doing that. You have a bit less control over where it goes in the future, and there's less of a, say, educational type and capacity building type aspect to it, but there is still some there. And then the final option, contract it out, get the consultants in. That's the quickest way, of course, to do it, but there is no long-term capacity being built up there. So, I mean, talk through that. Often these people are in a position to make some kind of informed decision about building up modeling capacity. And in fact, this was a flow chart we developed with UNFCCC. In fact, looking at the key questions to say which one of these 3 things is it best to go for. So the key questions we came up with: is the analysis one-off? So you just want to look at something and then that's it, job done. In that sort of situation, building up the capacity doesn't have a huge benefit, so just save the time and the cost, can contract it out. Then the next question, do we require answers quickly? What's the time that's available? So following down that link, do we know the future requirements? So how much capacity do we need? Bottom left, a really key issue, do we have the expertise in-house? We've seen too many times in the past that there's been really good, ambitious efforts to build up modeling tools, but then they're not maintained in the long run. And it's because of the specific expertise that's required. And unfortunately, it is a very specific expertise, and it can end up in a small number of people. And if they move on to new positions, then that capacity can get lost. So something else that needs to be considered. And then finally, as the box in the top right says, resources available are also a big input to this. So moving through quite quickly, but I wanted to give just 2 examples before the chair cuts me off for running out of time. The first one, Azerbaijan. I don't know if there are any representatives from Azerbaijan in the room, but this was part of an effort that's ongoing actually in an EU research project. You can see the logos at the bottom, which was linking to Azerbaijan to look at 2 key issues. How exposed is Azerbaijan to response measures in other countries, especially in the European Union? And is it possible to develop a diverse economic diversification process to address those issues? Now, it was decided that there would be some modeling to support this. So first task for us was to go and see the resources, the data that are out there. And we looked through that and we said, okay, there's not enough data to build a full-scale macroeconomic model, and to be honest, the EU research project was never going to go to those measures anyway. But it is possible to develop a fairly simple tool using a few time series of data plus an input-output table to join sectors together, linked to energy consumption and a bit on trade. And it's a very simple tool, but we can see it in its development already that you can get some rough ballpark estimates of what the scale of these impacts are going to be. And that's fairly minimal effort type exercise. Now, the other example goes really to the other end of the spectrum, and about India here. And this was a piece of work supported by Regulatory Assistance Project, see the logo in the corner, who were talking to policymakers in India, and they kept hitting across barriers that the policies were being designed at state level, but the assessment tools that were available to assess the key questions of jobs were at national level, and policy was getting stuck in the process because of that. So they came to us and said, do you think it's possible to build a model at state level? We checked the data, and by and large, a big effort was required, but it was possible to construct this tool. And in fact, this tool is now available for researchers in India to use under what we hope will be a free licensing agreement. And eventually, the idea is the model will take on a life of its own. So there's a big capacity building element here, because it's the researchers in India that are now using the model for their own research and for serious policy analysis as well, to answer these questions about renewable capacity and energy efficiency and what it means for trade in energy product, particularly coal in India, and ultimately for jobs as well. So that's is a very big tool with thousands of equations in it, completely different to the Azerbaijan assessment, but answering different questions, but really providing, I think, quite good value added to researchers. The last slide to conclude. 3 points. Quantitative analysis can play an important role in both planning and assessing policies. I think that's generally quite agreed upon now. The question is how to go about doing that in the most effective way. We heard from the last speaker already the term cost effectiveness. Yeah, absolutely. You don't always have to go to the most complicated tools available. Often something much more basic will answer the questions. And then the last point about developing capacity, it does need to be thought through carefully from a long-term perspective. There are lots of trade-offs there, but this balance between building capacity and looking at current cost effectiveness really is quite important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll try and take questions after we've listened to the other two presenters, so we can save some time. So we'll move on to the next presenter. That's Aaron Cosby from IISD. Aaron?
Okay. Thanks, William. Good afternoon. Like Brian, I'll start with a disclaimer. I'm not an expert. In fact, this isn't my work. I am an associate with the International Institute of Sustainable Development. I've worked in this area for a long time, but the work that I'm about to lay out for you was done by an associate of mine who is seriously ill and could not make it. His apologies. This allows me the advantage of being able to take credit for his good work. However, any shortcomings or omissions are not my problem. That out of the way. I'm going to distinguish a little bit what I'm about to present to you from the last two presentations. Both of those talked about modeling and estimating the impacts of response measures that were undertaken domestically and the impacts on the domestic undertaking state. The work done here tries to take a different view of response measures. That is, what are the impacts of response measures undertaken in another country on my country? And this, to some extent, echoes very well the discussions we've been having in this forum on the impact of the implementation of response measures. Although both are contemplated in that agenda item, a lot of the discussion has been around the type of response measures I'm going to be discussing here. So one of the quirks of presenting somebody else's work is that you'll find out I'm not going to follow some of these slides in the way they're set out here. So the overview, as I'm going to give it to you, I'll first run through what Peter and his team have created. It's a guidebook on how a country would go about assessing the implementation or the impacts of the implementation of response measures. And that's a sort of an abstract thing, and I expect I'll try to make it not boring, but to try to make it more interesting, I will then run through how that guidebook has been applied in a couple of case studies, and those case studies will be energy subsidy reform and a study of transportation carbon levies, maritime and aviation carbon levies. And hopefully that way I'll give you a picture of how the guidebook works out in practice, and I'll try to keep you awake. I know it's late in the afternoon. So the approach, first of all, the conceptual approach runs something like this. You have a response measure undertaken in an implementing country. The basic transmission mechanism is trade. So the country undertaking that mechanism either changes its demand for a product that your country is exporting, or its supply of a product for which your country competes for markets in third countries. That creates price effects which drive impacts in your home country in terms of either increased or decreased markets for those goods that are affected. And there you have it. What I've done to combat climate change has resulted in impacts either positive or negative in some third country. And we're very interested in knowing how you go about estimating what those impacts are. There are, of course, non-trade channels of impact from response measures that flow to other countries. We can think about how financial flows or flows of investment are changed as a result of response measures. We can think about remittances. We can think about the migration of people in response to response measures. We can think about the external impacts, and some of them aren't external to the measures undertaken, climate change mitigation, or other externalities, pollution of air and water. These are important transmission vehicles, but I'm not going to talk about them, and the guidebook doesn't talk about them. We're focusing here solely on the trade-related impacts. There are a number of methods that we can use to assess the impacts, the tools of actually modeling the impacts. And we've heard from Hector about the excellent tools that Cambridge Econometrics uses. But the tools, as he said, range all the way from a very simple analysis to a computable general equilibrium analysis, which is a monster. I'll get into, when I look at the case studies, how we choose which of these tools we actually utilize. The heart of the recommendations in the guidebook are contained in these 5 steps. If you're setting about this daunting task, first you have to identify what the causal relationships are. So a response measure has been undertaken. What do we expect to happen as a result of that? What flows of trade do we expect to be impacted? Then we need to figure out what indicators we need to, what data we need in order to try to figure out what is actually happening. We have to figure out, on the basis of deciding what impacts we want to look at, what are the appropriate modeling approaches, what models best fit the kinds of information we want to get. Then we run the model, you customize the model to get those pieces of information. We run the model, and finally, you don't run it. Finally, you define the scenarios you're looking at, what types of policies and what are the details of those policies, what assumptions are we going to make, run it, figure out the impacts. It all sounds straightforward, I'm sure. But I'll run you through a couple of examples, as I promised, to try to make the thing more concrete for you. In the area of subsidies, I mean, I'm going to skip this. We were defining subsidies in this case the way the WTO defines them. If there are any trade freaks out there, we're using SCM Article 1.1, but not SCM Article 1.2. I don't expect that means much, and I apologize. The data sources we're using for energy subsidies are well known and are much better than they were even a few years ago. But OECD has an excellent inventory of support measures. The IEA also has a really excellent database of the types of energy subsidies out there, and of course they've also done work on impacts. The most important types of subsidies, there's a whole range we could imagine of subsidy policies and reform policies that might be undertaken in service of climate change mitigation and adaptation. They run all the way from fossil fuel subsidy reform, that is removing of subsidies to coal, oil and gas, other fossil fuels, to putting in place subsidies for renewable energy. There's a whole range. We can even talk about agriculture and forestry subsidy reforms. The one we'll focus on in this case study is fossil fuel subsidy reform. Before I come to that, so the first step of the analysis is figuring out if we've identified fossil fuel subsidy reform as the policy we want to analyze, what are the key linkages that we need to suss out and understand in order to figure out what the impacts of that are going to be. So we've constructed this monster table that I don't propose to try to run you through. It won't fit on a screen. There are 2 missing columns here looking at the impacts in terms of households and in terms of environment. And there are a couple of, there's a missing row in terms of cross-border impacts. But basically we run a matrix like this that says, what are the different types of impacts, direct, indirect, cross-border, in the various areas we might be looking at in the macroeconomy, in businesses, in households, and the environmental impacts. We fill in all these boxes as a conceptual exercise to start the process. That's step 1. But the step that comes when we try to figure out what type of method we want to use to assess those impacts is illustrated here. Again, this is from a much bigger table. By the way, I should have said this at the outset. We've produced this a monstrous draft report, and it's sitting with the poor secretariat who has the job of reviewing it, and will be a public document soon. And these tables are in probably more detail than you would like, but they lay out the kind of thinking, and it will soon be a publicly available document. They lay out the kind of thinking you would need to do in order to figure out what's the best analytical method to use to try to identify these impacts. So, more concretely, in step 1, the hypothesis is that fossil fuel subsidy reform leads to significant impacts on the trade of energy products. This is more or less straightforward. We're talking here, in this case, by the way, about consumer subsidy reform, not producer subsidy reform. it's a shortcoming in the methodology, in my opinion, but it was made necessary by the data available. So if we do eliminate globally consumer subsidies to fossil fuels, you can imagine that would have a huge impact on the consumption of fossil fuels. It would lower the consumption of fossil fuels. That would have amazing environmental impacts, and that would be the reason we would undertake it. It would also, of course, have incidental impacts on oil importing and oil exporting states. So this is what we're thinking about in terms of the impacts. Carbon leakage, I'm not going to get into, well, if it is, I won't get into that. This is a complicated piece of the analysis. In step 2, what types of indicators do we need to get a handle on in order to do this analysis? Well, we need to know the traded energy prices and volumes, trade balances, import and export volumes, real exchange rates, GDP, GHG emissions, because we're also looking at environmental impacts. So given what we want to find out, what kinds of models are out there that are appropriate to giving us that data? The study we looked at was done by OECD, by Bernot et al., and they used the OECD's environmental linkage models. This is a computable general equilibrium model that links up economy and environment, ideally suited to the kind of analysis we want to do. It'll give us what we want if we can tell it how to shock the system. But we need to specify, step 4, exactly what kinds of assumptions we're using here. So we're covering the 40 countries in their database. We're assuming just consumer subsidies, not producer subsidies. We have to assume price elasticities for each of the energy types. This is a particularly important piece of the modeling with significant impacts on the results. That is to say, at some point you have to say, if I raise gas prices by $1, what will that do to the demand for fossil fuels? What's the responsiveness of demand to that change in price? That's a magic number that nobody knows. We can estimate it, and we do estimate it, but it's particular, and we use econometric techniques to estimate it, but it's a particularly important piece of the assumptions. Step 5, what are the scenarios? We're talking about this particular case study used unilateral subsidy reforms and also global subsidy reforms to look at what would happen in both cases, and extended the scenario out to 2050. Now that we've made all these assumptions, we figured out what models we want to use, we run it. The results are here. I don't know if you're as interested in seeing the results as you are in finding out about what the process looks like, but in a nutshell, oil importing countries did very well because the prices of oil fell, because demand fell, because some global prices went up. Oil exporting countries did well in some respects because they were able to, having reduced the subsidies to oil, their domestic consumption of that oil went down and they were able to export more of it. But of course, the global prices went down as well, and they end up actually losing in this scenario. And we had some nice GHG emission results, 3% reduction by 2020, increasing to a 10% reduction by 2050. So just a side note, promotion for the work that Peter and his crew do, they're focused on fossil fuel subsidy reform. This 10% reduction by 2050 is not bad. One more case study to run you through, and it's not going to be carbon trading and border carbon adjustment. Sorry. I'll come back to that slide at the end because it has some powerful illustrations that I want to run through. But the case study is actually going to be shipping and aviation. So if we did contemplate imposing a carbon levy on shipping and aviation, what would be the impacts? Well, so number 1, step 1, again, we figure out what are the likely impacts. Well, any country that has a tourism business is going to be impacted because people fly usually to tourist destinations. Any country that is trade intensive, that does a lot of trade, either importing or exporting, is going to be probably impacted because the goods have to arrive either by ships or by planes. And this applies whether you're a big exporter or whether you're a small island state that has to import everything. These are the kind of countries and linkages we would expect to see the impacts showing up in. The authors of this particular study, this is Anger et al., figured out, having decided what kind of impacts they wanted to capture, had to use a particular kind of set of models. You want to know what's the responsiveness of the airline industry and the marine shipping industry to a carbon levy. are they just going to pay that money, or are there actual technological improvements that they could resort to try to lower their costs? It turns out, well, and so we use the marginal abatement cost curve model that tries to figure out what happens to shipping industry as you raise those costs. And it turns out there's not a lot of technology in the pipeline, so they're basically going to pay the money. Same thing with the airline industry. But these are the kinds of models you would use. The Aero model looks at the same kinds of questions in the context of the aviation industry. These are the kind of models you would use because you have determined what kinds of results and linkages you're looking for. So the modeling chosen is quite specific to the questions you're asking, right? They actually used a Cambridge econometrics model, the E3MG. Once you've decided what the impacts are going to be in terms of price, you plug those prices in and you say, here's the increased prices of maritime and aviation transportation. What are the impacts on these countries of raising those prices? Now you need a computable general equilibrium model to tell you what those impacts are going to be. They couldn't use such a model for the smaller countries in the study. They had bigger countries were Mexico, China, India, and one other, and a bunch of small island states or trade-dependent states for which the data wasn't available and the models weren't available. They had to custom make models for those countries. Okay? The data sources were fairly straightforward. The scenarios were a $30 a ton carbon levy. 15% of the allowances were auctioned. The rest were allotted free. All of the cost of the carbon levy was passed through to consumers. And they ran a sensitivity analysis. So they assumed $10, $30, and $50. But the 30 was the scenario they mainly stuck with. The results, well, as I said, you don't get a lot of, out of these models, the airline industry doesn't actually have a lot of technological solutions. So you basically get a reduction in shipping and a reduction in aviation. The global GDP impact is very small, but the localized impact for some of these countries is far from insignificant. So in Samoa, we had almost a 1% drop in GDP. Cook Islands, about a 0.5% drop in GDP. Trinidad and Tobago, 0.16. One of the assumptions used in these models was revenue recycling. That is, the money you get from the auction of allowances is funneled back into the target countries for their own use. If we remove that assumption, the impacts are significantly higher. So where do we come as a result of all this? I'll give you just a couple of concluding thoughts. The first concluding thought is, it is possible, and you know, the discussion here, I've been sitting in on the response measures discussion, and the problem is there's a dearth of modeling experience out there. There's a dearth of attempts to try to figure out what these impacts are. It is possible to get at these impacts. It's not easy. It hasn't been done much, partly because we haven't had really significant response measures put in place yet, and just partly because we haven't had experience with the modeling, right? The second thing to note, I have three, is the specific difficulties that developing countries will have in trying to do these kinds of estimates. As we saw in the context of the aviation and maritime transport study, we had to create custom models because the existing CGE models weren't specific enough and the data didn't exist in enough abundance to allow them to be used on an off-the-shelf basis for those countries. We had to construct models for those countries. Right? The third thing that I want to emphasize is that if we were hoping to find a sort of plug-and-play solution, an off-the-box program that we could put in our computers and go, carbon tax implemented by the EU, what's the impact in South Africa? That is not going to happen. I think we run through some of the specificities that were involved in the two case studies mentioned here. And now I get to go back to the slide that I missed and I promised I would come back to. Talking, for example, about border carbon adjustment, never mind all the other complications, we need to figure out there are so many assumptions in the regime of a border carbon adjustment regime that will massively transform the results we get out of it. Are we talking about a BCA on exports and imports as well? how do we figure out how much carbon is embedded in a good when it comes to the border? What's the methodology we're using? What's the baseline we're going to use? The EU ETS went through a massively complex process of trying to figure out what the baseline carbon content of good was for its ETS. You would have to do something like that. Are we going to make, is the regime going to make allowances for other countries' carbon mitigation efforts and lower the levy for some countries or eliminate the levy for some countries? Is there going to be revenue? I mean, you get through all of these assumptions just to try to, before you ever get to a model, before you touch a model, you have to run through all this stuff. So the point is, there is no plug and play solution. It's a very complex endeavor. It can be done, and I'm sure we will be doing it, but challenging. And I hope that this work that Peter and his crew have done gets us a step closer to understanding how it could be done at the country level. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks again, Cosby, for that stimulating presentation. We'll move on to the last presenter, Pradeep. And after that, I'll open the floor to you participants for some questions to the three presenters.
Good afternoon, everybody. I will be presenting on two case studies. My colleagues who just presented, the flow is quite, logical. The first presentation covered the overall overview of the modeling concepts to measure impacts. And then the IISD presentation looked specifically at one response measure, which was the carbon tax or carbon subsidy, and then see how it impacted the cross-border impacts of various countries. I can use this one, page and up, page down. Okay. So among the normally discussed response measures, some 7 or 8 of them, I will present case studies on standardization labeling and on the energy policy reforms and green public investments. The standardization labeling case study would be based on cost-benefit analysis. This is to show that we need not rely on sophisticated models, but can apply a cost-benefit analysis to come out with some sort of impacts. And then the second case study is an actual case study which was carried out for the European Union for 28 countries. And it looks at the impacts, cross-border impacts using CGE modeling tool. And in fact, that tool used a hybrid model, which was using GEM3 and primes. So they had a combination of two models, which had an engineering bottoms-up approach and then CGE. So I'll first discuss the standards and labeling policy. If this policy was implemented, then obviously what were the implications of it? First of all, we know that the standard and labeling program has been in existence for more than 3 decades, and I think even more longer. And it is now applied among 17 countries and I think 54 products. So this has been in practice for quite a long time, and most of the developed countries have already implemented in a large number of products. Just to tell you, in India, we have just started implementing in 2006, but this policy now, is taking shape in an accelerated manner. But to start off the program and implement, it took us about 4 years. So that's the kind of implication it has once you start implementing this particular program. We need to see the time lags and other things. So the context of telling you this was that the response measure, the standards and labeling policy is already an ongoing program in most of the developed countries. The developing countries are the ones who are going to be implementing this now in the future. So we have to see the cross-border impacts from that particular context. I have just put up the slides, and the definitions for standards and labeling are there. I think most of you will probably be aware of this, so I will not go into that detail. So when you actually look at implementing this particular program, you have to see whether the country is ready for it, whether you have the necessary institutions, and you have the testing protocols, the standards which are there. So the entire foundation has to be laid, and then we need to see the implications of this particular program. So if we just have a look at it, this particular slide, when you look at this graph and you see the number of units sold on the y-axis and the energy efficiency on the x-axis, you can see that if there were no standards, then most of the units that would be purchased would be the dotted curve which you see, and maximum number of units that would be sold would be at an efficiency which is the peak of this curve. But then you are also selling a large number of appliances which are not of international standards, and they are very high energy consuming equipment. So if you implement this particular standard, and that's the vertical blue line which says that you have a standard, so no longer these equipment which are not complying to these standards will not be available, and therefore the purchases would be definitely done based on the thick brown line which is there. And the subsequent implications, if you have standard and labeling, you'll see that it has a much more better implication. So that is the reason why we adopt standards and labeling. But then having said that, and having said that, this labeling program is just the tip of an iceberg. So there are a lot of policy initiatives that have to be taken. You have to see which products you have to target. What are your testing and reporting registration requirements? Do you have an established laboratory testing facilities? It's a process which is quite extensive. And for example, I like to tell you that for having standards program in India for the fans, we did not have a testing facility protocol, uniform protocol for the fans, ceiling fans. So it goes into quite a lot of details, and it needs a lot of other expertise to carry out this particular program. So this says what are the steps that are involved and how this process goes on, and it's actually a feedback effect, and you keep revising this particular program. So now if you look at this particular slide, so this tries to capture the cross-border impacts of this particular program. And many of the developing countries are exporting countries, including India and China, which sells product globally. And if they follow this particular program, then there are implications, both positive and negative, on the country, as well as the export implications which are there. So this particular diagrams tells us what are the steps that are involved and how one could carry out the impacts at the utility level, at the manufacturer level, and carry out an impact analysis at the environmental level as well. Now the cross-border implications come when you have actually an harmonization of standards between the importing countries, and where trade relationships grow or will enhance. So that's where the cross-border impacts will take place in terms of beneficial impacts of trade. So I'm going to talk about an actual program on the Mexico, and Mexico program indicates that this was an actual analysis carried out for the impacts and analysis, which ranged from 1994 to 2005 for 4 of their products. So they adopted a similar methodology which I just described, and will bring out the impacts of this. So I'll be a little faster in terms of explaining this, but in case there are questions, I can definitely take them as it is. So I will not go into this background, but I'll look at this methodology. So when we look at the methodology, we see how the methodology is carried out at the user end, which looks at the savings, the incremental costs, the avoided building, and the NPV for the users. And similarly, we look at, for the utilities, the megawatt hour generation savings, avoided capacity installed, avoided generation, and similarly avoided income and the net present value for the utility. So in looking at this, all the stakeholders are captured in this particular methodology. And then the interrelations of these are explained in this particular slide, which looks at how we look at the various interactions and how these benefits are captured. So this shows the results only for the refrigerator, which shows that the energy kilowatt hour is declining. If you look at the left square over here and the graph, which indicates various years and kilowatt hour. And beneath that curve, if you look at, that shows for the utilities, how the avoided capacity has been there, which is on the left-hand side, gigawatt hour capacity installation. And similarly, the energy consumption and savings, which are there in terawatt hours, shown over here. So if you look at this graph, this table, it will give you the actual savings which are there. And this is only for household refrigerators, just to give you an implication of how the impacts have been captured. So the cumulative terawatt hour impacts, which are there in the year 2000 and 2005 and 2015, it gives the impact. So it captures ex post and ex ante impacts of the energy efficiency standards and labeling program. It also, at the utility, similarly at the utility level, you will see that there is an impact. And the utility level, the impacts are negative because there is an economic loss, because there's a revenue loss for the utility. And the avoided generation results into avoided emissions due to non-combustion of fossil fuels. So similarly for the entire program, when you look at for the refrigerators, air conditioners, motors, and washing machines, we can capture the total impacts. But this is just looking at the impacts based on a cost-benefit analysis method. So the conclusion here is that implementing this particular program definitely resulted in higher energy efficiency, and there was a harmonization of trades, harmonization of technical standards with the technical and intergovernmental, arrangements. So they had a prolonged trade, a trade agreement, NAFTA, which now no longer probably exists, between Canada and US. And they didn't maintain the separate production line for domestic market and for the export market, and that was the benefit that they derived from this particular program. So now I'll move to the second case study, which actually the modeling concepts were explained by the earlier presenters. So we're looking at two concepts here. We're looking at energy policy, and then we're looking at the green public investments. And the role that energy policy has to play, is very critical, and it defines the roles for various stakeholders. And that includes the government's role, which is to foster innovation and support deployment and scaling up of new technologies. So that's one of the key elements which leads to the second policy element, which is the green public investments. So the importance of green public investments have been actually well established in economics, and it helps in setting up green infrastructure, and also it helps in promoting and mobilizing climate resilient technologies and low emission technologies. So if you look at the economic interactions, if I just take energy efficiency itself and see what are the energy efficiency, I'll go through some important slides, I think. So there are exogenous changes, and then the impacts of that on the subsequent, in the sectors, and how that impacts the trade as well as the industry itself. So if we bring about a policy change by introducing public investments and bringing about energy efficiency, which results in reduced fuel costs, it also reduces the energy prices, and then which impacts imports and exports as well as industry outputs, depending on how it has impacted the industry. And the increased real income or decreased real income will also impact the consumption patterns. And so the implication of the policy is captured in this particular framework, and this leads to the modeling concept. Now, if we look at the GEM3 modeling, which is the CG modeling, this provides a sort of framework which, when the previous speaker spoke about the consumption varying with respect to changes in prices, we are talking about elasticities and then the benchmarking the equilibrium data, and then calibrating the model, and then replicating it for the base year, and then providing the exogenous assumptions for technical progress, population growth rates, and other parameters. We first carry out a reference scenario which takes into consideration all the existing policies of the set of countries that we consider for analysis. And then we carry out our policy assumptions, and then we do a run for the policy scenarios. The comparison of these two runs will provide us insights for policy making. So, the importance is just brought out from this particular part. But without going into other details, it is important to emphasize that it's a big model. It represents, it captures 38 regions and 29 sectors, and it's linked through endogenous bilateral trade. So it captures everything, and it needs a lot of data, which is shown here, including input-output tables, national accounts, employment activities, and other aspects. This particular case study here was focused on assessing the employment due to energy efficiency. So what level of the research questions could be framed in this way? What is the level of employment currently associated with energy efficiency across Europe? And what is the potential for creating employment related to energy efficiency? And then what kind of policy instruments that could be provided to assist in increasing energy efficiency? And also it looked at the skill sets required, and the social implications. Obviously, I mean, energy efficiency is well researched, and the co-benefits of that are indicated here. Okay.
Because the time is right against us and we need to take some questions. So,
okay.
Yeah, if you can wrap up.
So I just want to just focus on this slide, and I'll conclude without going into the results. Is that, you know, the modeling exercise here is that there is a change that is simulated, that is the expenditure in energy efficiency, which triggers an increase in demand for sector providing inputs to energy efficiency. And the outcome is positive on the activities and employment related in this particular sector. And similarly, you have a simulation that goes on for increased energy savings, which has a negative effect on activities and employment in the energy sector per se, and reduction of energy imports. But the more important aspect here is the crowding out due to the equity-based, you know, funding, where actually when all the funding is increased in financing for energy efficiency, then it has a negative impact if you proceed further to increase the energy efficiency. So without going into the results, I'm just concluding that there are two important key results. One is the maximum impact on the economy is in the moderate energy efficiency scenario, and the increase in energy efficiency has a slight negative impact on the GDP. So with this, I conclude the results are there, and if it is required, it can be shared. But I leave it to you people. You can have questions. You can ask.
Oh, sorry, Freddie, we have to rush you through it because we want to also have some questions and maybe get some interactions with the participants. But thank you very much for the presentation. Can I open the floor now to participants if there are any questions, and it could be to any of the three presenters. So the floor is open.
We were very clear.
Okay. Yes, please. The second one, yeah.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. My name is Kesh Matsuda, representing the Global Chemical Industry Associations. My question to you, some of you, you know, ex-ante analysis is fine, but at some point we need, you know, ex-post analysis. So what kind of tools do you have for that, or any recommendations for that?
Okay. Were you asking? Yeah. Maybe we'll take some more questions before I give the floor to the expert to respond. Yes, please. Identify yourself. And
okay, thanks a lot. I'm Daniel from GIZ, German International Corporation. I would have two questions. One, we are increasingly asked to show the aggregated impacts, emission reduction impacts of all of our projects. So including more technical projects, but also capacity building projects on climate change. You as modelers, would you say this, would you engage in such an endeavor if I would ask you join us there, or would you say this is not a serious business? And the second question is, I was quite happy to hear that essential parts of modeling are kind of decisions to be taken by stakeholders, by policymakers, and sometimes, of course, policymakers would love to say, okay, you modelers, just give me the answer in the end, whether to follow option A or B. Then you can go to your lab and come back and give me the answer. So, but of course, we need this interface with during modeling, probably with policymakers, with stakeholders. So what for you would be the the best setup for such a process for interaction with you guys? Thanks.
Any additional questions? Oh, yes. The organizer is asking a question. Okay.
Yeah, we can. A very simple question I would like to have about this, which Hector has given on E3 model for India, E3 India. I just want to know a little more that it is specific for one state, or it's a bit flexible for using by other many states in India. And second thing is how flexible this model is in case this has to be applied for other countries.
Okay. So would you want to start, Hector? And then we go down. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for the questions. I can come back on all three. Ex post analysis, I agree, it's often forgotten about. It is important. Not all the modeling tools can cover ex post analysis. The econometric modeling is generally better suited to it as it's looking in the past anyway. So certainly the work we do, you can go forward or backwards. It almost doesn't matter to some extent. There's not so much demand for it. That's what we found, but it is possible. Yeah, GIZ aggregating across projects. I get questions like this sometimes. Maybe I'm a bit cavalier sometimes. I say, well, anything can be modeled, but you need some assumptions to do it. The question is, at what point do those assumptions become too big that it takes the value away from the results? I think try to identify the uncertainties. If there is one bit of it, like the capacity building, that could be bigger than everything else, or it's too big a range on it, maybe get a number without that bit and add the capacity building on. I think it needs a discussion, but I wouldn't rule it out, though, put it that way. Yeah, the interaction with the policymakers, this is really important, actually. So everyone knows economists like to go away and just talk to other economists and not anybody else. We've got to get away from that. Modelers are even worse. It's just there should be an interaction at every stage with the policy people, also with the legal people as well. I've seen so many exercises of even global carbon taxes, of just policies being done that they're not politically feasible, they're not legally feasible either, but a lot of resources are put into this. So certainly at the beginning, for scenario design, at initial results stage, and at conclusions on each of those steps. Right, E3 India, it's a big model, and it was a big project to build the model. In principle, the approach can be used in any country that has adequate state or province level data. It needs a certain amount of effort and it was a 1-year task to build the model. It's the model for India now. The plan is to make it freely available to researchers under a licensing arrangement. So they will be able to take it on, use it for their own research. And in that sense, it gains academic credibility, but it also starts to feed into the policy process, which I think there is some work to be done there. But the guys at RAP who have pushed this forward are really quite active in actually getting the model out there and people using it. So that sort of outreach part of it is as big a bit of the effort as the actual model building itself.
Okay. So
I don't want to take too much time away from the people that actually know what they're talking about on modeling questions, but very quickly, on ex post tools, I agree that they exist, but first, yes, I hope eventually we'll get into ex post modeling of the impact of response measures, but that may be an optimistic assumption. We may not need to if we don't actually implement any response measures in the near future. On modeling, for example, capacity building, I have a lot of sympathy. I've been called on many times over the years to demonstrate the impacts of projects I've been on, which, you know, the idea of trying to define causality and allocate the final results to the various different bits that contributed to them, call it an imprecise science at best. I mean, I completely understand the desire on the part of funders to get a grip on whether they have effectively spent their money or not. I'm very sympathetic to that. But there are some instances in which modeling is really a waste of time in that respect. But that's coming from a non-modeler, right? And finally, on your second question, I think one of the things, if any sort of consensus has come out of the many years that countries have been working on the debates about the implementation of the impacts of the implementation of response measures, it is that we need to be better aware at the stage where we are developing policy of what the impacts of those policies are going to be. So the simple admonition is, before you put in place a policy, at the point of developing that policy, be aware of the international impacts as well as the domestic impacts. Most countries are good at assessing the domestic impacts, but the international impacts are extremely important, especially on an issue like climate change, which is inherently global.
Regarding the ex-ante and ex-post analysis, that most of the energy efficiency analysis is ex-post. And I think if you're aware of all the IEA studies on energy efficiency, will tell you that they have carried out an ex-post analysis on most of them. So the tools that you typically use would be econometric methods or the cost-benefit analysis methods that are used here. So that kind of analysis, but I think there are newer models who are addressing both ex-post and ante analysis that is being done on. So there are newer models which are coming out and addressing them. And the question on whether we interact with the policymakers or how is modeling done, let me tell you, the studies that I have personally carried out have always carried out with stakeholder discussions with different stakeholders, whether it is at the government level, at the research lab level, or at the industrial level, or just at the general ministry level, and even the academia level. So number of stakeholders, the discussion should be held before you do your modeling. Firstly, there is large acceptability. Secondly, the results are very robust, the kinds of results that you will get just not sitting in an ivory tower and doing something, but having inputs from a lot of people at the ground level, the results are totally startlingly different. So the inputs that you get would be quite relevant. So that's an important element in modeling, which is actually, modeling is never done in vacuum. It's always done with stakeholder discussions. And there was one third question which was also there, which was
modeling aggregating policy, the climate change impacts of policy change, capacity building, programs.
The programs there. Okay, that's fine. I think that's answered.
Okay, so let's see whether we can take a few more minutes. We have 2 minutes to close. If there are additional questions, quickly. Okay.
Yeah,
yes, Joe.
Thank you very much. I'm Joseph from Ghana. My really concern is that this is a comment that if you are not very careful, we are going to overemphasize on models. I think the key thing is the methodology that we select. That will advise you the kind of model to use. Because what are models? Model is just a mathematical set of equations. Somebody put them together for you to make whatever problem you want to or challenge you to make simpler. That's all. Listen, so to me, the key to the methodology that you want to shoot. I guess that could be the reason why you selected even your topic as a theme as methodologies for assessing the impacts of this and this and that. So that's the comment I make, that the key is the methodologies. If you get them, then now you see what all the models you have, which of them will help you to tackle the challenge easiest or the simplest. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think that is an important comment, and I think that was the point Brian was emphasizing, that the devil is in the detail. Is at that stage that countries face that challenge. How do we select the methods, or what are the methods to do the assessment? And I think that is what you want to respond to. That, yeah, Pradeep.
Let's say if we're talking about a country which has all the databases like the European Union, then I would definitely go for a very sophisticated model, because you have all the data, so you can get all kinds of results, the simplest results, as well as you can drill down deeply and get many more results. But if there's a country which lacks data, and also lacks institutional capability, and lacks the capability, the technical manpower required for modeling, then it's a challenge. And there is a need to create this particular capacity first by doing with somebody, along with somebody who has a capacity, and gradually build up that capacity. And it takes a long time to build a modeling team. It takes a very, very long time to build if you have a dedicated team, then it can easily take, with technical skill manpower, then it can easily take 4 to 5 years when you come up with a modeling team which can provide results of any kind. So that is what I can say in short. In terms of deciding the tool, you have to have a checklist, what kind of databases you have, what kind of institutional capacity you have, what kind of technical manpower you have, and what kind of analysis do you want? Do you want a basic level analysis, or you want an in-depth analysis? Then I will choose, based on my country's capacity, taking the holistic picture, choose a tool appropriate according to the skill sets that are available and the constraints that are there.
Hector, do you want to answer that? I think your decision tree sort of talks
a bit. And first of all, I very much agree with the comment. We sort of live in a world today where everybody wants numbers, and they come from models that we shouldn't put too much reliance on that. The modeling is only part of the assessment. There's everything that goes around that as well. In terms of the best approach to use for a particular analysis, there was a decision tree, and taking into account the data that are available, and that can get you so far. And where do you go for advice? I don't know if I can point to these guys, but other countries that have gone through this already can provide advice on that. So there is another sort of cross-border interaction there. But yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor. Hector, sorry. Any additional questions? Otherwise, I will just say that, yeah, it's been a very interesting presentations that we have received, and thanks to Pradeep, Cosby, and Hector for the presentations. Certainly, I hope you'll be able to gather 1 or 2 ideas going back home. What is the challenge ahead of me, ahead of you, and how would you carry out this assessment? I think what we're trying to do, working with these aspects, is to be able to come up with very simple methodologies that will allow countries to start looking at these issues. And like South Africa is saying, you don't need even to wait until these methodologies are there. There are already existing ones that you can already plug and play. So why not start? And if you have questions, let us know. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for being with us, and especially thanks to you, our presenters. So if there are any questions, the team is here. You can ask them whatever you want to know, and we'll be happy to assist. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.
I'll leave you this paper. I don't know if you need it.
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Fantastic. Nice.
YouTube, right? New experience to do. How you decided like I know. Thank you. Thank you.